Hi everyone, Steve here from RSM, and welcome to our latest edition of our Coffee Conversation series. Today I'm joined by Mark Gregory. Mark is the Chief Executive Officer of Melco Engineering, together with occupying a non-executive director role with a couple of boards as well. So Mark, thanks very much for taking time out of your day to join us today. Perhaps before we start though, as I discussed when we were discussing this today. This is all about having a chat over a coffee, something that you and I are used to doing more often than not, face to face or in person rather than via Zoom. But current times dictate that we do things a little bit differently. But can I ask, could you share with us what you're drinking this afternoon?
Well, Steve, I'm drinking a mug of herbal tea, which is probably is my afternoon routine. So I normally start with a coffee from Merlot's coffee from Mary Ryan's bookshop in Park Road, which my office is just above that store. But in the afternoons I sort of revert to herbal tea, which apparently makes me sleep at night time. So I don't know what would happen if I didn't drink the herbal tea. I'd be a wipeout at night, but in theory, the herbal tea works.
I think that's very wise. And in the afternoon, again, I try to limit my caffeine intake. This afternoon I've got a Whiskey Jack Ale from the Whistler Brewing Company. Actually, just kidding, the pencil holder. I am drinking a herbal tea as well. So again, Mark, thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps before we get into the topic of discussion, if you could share with us a little bit about yourself and your own background.
Certainly, Steve. So I guess as a professional, I'm an accountant by profession, and I sort of say to people, everyone has to be something. But my career has been sort of quite diverse since my early accounting days. So I grew up and did my training in regional New South Wales in Lismore. But in sort of early part of my training, I actually joined a regional media company, which was Northern Star Holdings, which probably most people will not have heard of, but they were a large listed public company domiciled in Lismore, Northern New South Wales. And so I started out as doing the audit on that company in a chartered accounting firm, then got poached to join that company. So they were that was my early years in a career in media that sort of spanned 20 years or thereabouts. And just as some quick background information, in the late 1980s, Westfield Corporation, which is Frank Lowy's company, commenced an investment company called Westfield Capital, and they engaged David Gonski, who I think most people will have heard of, to head up that business, and they used Northern Star Holdings as the vehicle to acquire Network 10, nationally. So sort of long story short, I worked in Northern Star Holdings regional media, and then transferred to Channel 10 under that sort of new ownership arrangement in Sydney as financial controller of the network. And I was there for a number of years and then moved to Brisbane with Channel 10 and headed up Channel 10 in Brisbane. So that was that was a really quick overview of 20 years in media, but it was a blast at the time. And I thought, and then with digital media and internet and online media platforms, free-to-air television was a good industry to be getting out of, which I did in about 2003, and got into property and real estate with the Ray White Group, which, Steve, is where I met you, in fact.
Indeed it is.
Back in early 2003. And it was a real change, sort of going from large bureaucratic listed company to a privately owned company. Not just privately owned, it was sort of actively managed by a very successful entrepreneur in Brian White and the White family. And so that was it was very different, very challenging for me with the background that I had. But probably one of the best learning experiences that I've ever had, to be quite honest. And so I was there for a number of years in the role of finance director, and then left there and decided to go into my own consulting business. And my the premise for my consultancy was that I would apply my learnings from large listed company that had strong disciplines and systems, and it was fairly regimented, but sort of, very systemised and professional, and strong corporate governance, and then compared to privately owned company owned by an entrepreneur, which was very nimble, very fast moving, sort of made decisions quickly. And so there was sort of good and bad from both worlds. So I guess the basis of my model under my consultancy was to take the good from both worlds and apply that to my consultancy business, which I have done, and hopefully I've done reasonably successfully. So my first client in my consultancy business was a mining services company, which I sort of helped them acquire a couple of organisations, and then I joined as CEO, and that was a company called Swift Engineering in Mackay. We sold that business to a large American company. I then moved into the walls construction business, which likewise was a mining services and construction company, for 6 years. Excuse me. I then joined Cadeco Limited, which is actually a mining company. It was a listed public company, largely controlled by the Chinese. So I was in the CEO role and consulting role in that business for two and a half years. And then about a year ago, I left that company and joined Melco Engineering, which is where I sort of currently am. And along the way, I've had a few board positions. So in a nutshell, I've sort of been 20 years in media earlier on, my last 15 years in mining and mining services, with a small period of real estate and property in between. So it's across different roles and different capacities. So it's sort of, my career has been quite diverse and really interesting, and one that I have enjoyed immensely.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks, Mark. And certainly, diversity is a word that we'd certainly use in your journey. Maybe if we could just bring you to the current point in time and share with us a little about Melco, Melco Engineering.
Yes, so Melco is another privately owned company. It's been commenced by the current proprietor 25 years ago. So he's owned that business from sort of startup for that period. It's a specialist heavy fabrication company. So it actually has three sort of state-of-the-art workshops or fabrication facilities in Mackay, in Bowen, and at Hay Point, sort of between the two coal terminals at Hay Point, and specialises in large complex structures such as sort of ship loaders and ship loader booms and stacker reclaimers. So you know all those things, Steve, I can tell. Along with mining products and truck bodies and excavator buckets and dragline buckets, and so full new builds and rebuilds, as well as providing services on site at the mine sites, sort of shutdowns and maintenance and installation work. So it's quite a diversified mining services business across fabrication and maintenance on site in workshops, largely coal centric. In being in central Queensland, which is what sort of, and with some exposure to sugar. So that's sort of what central Queensland largely is, mining and sugar. And that's sort of where this particular business sits, and sort of what we have plans as to what we sort of want to do to limit that exposure to, or that concentration to those two sectors. But that's the business. And my mandate, I guess, coming into the business, I'm obviously not a technical fabrication expert or maintenance expert. My sort of what I will bring to this business, hopefully, is a strategy which helps the business to grow and diversify, and create something, which is, I guess, a more diversified business, and that is sustainable, sort of, long term, particularly with what will be an inevitable downturn and less, lower exposure to coal.
And Mark, maybe moving from that, turning to the inevitable downturn, the current environment, global pandemic, and everything else that seems to go with it. What challenges have you had to deal with in the business in recent times? Is there anything that you'd sort of call out that you'd share with us? It
probably impacted me as an individual more than the business or the other people involved in the business, and that's just simply because the restrictions on travel and sort of interacting with people. So I'm in Brisbane. It was difficult to get to Mackay, but the business in Mackay largely remained the same. We had people in the workshop, which they have to you can't sort of fabricate things from home. And on site, our people were still on site doing project work, and the people in the office were sort of supporting those activities. So I was probably the only individual that was actually largely impacted by COVID, and it dealt with that in the normal sort of manner of Zoom meetings and a lot of telephone discussions, and then when I could get to Mackay, I would, including driving on a couple of occasions when that was the only option available to me. But so that was sort of in a sort of a in the sense of how it impacted individuals and probably in the management of that business. But largely, the mining industry, luckily, sort of to date hasn't been largely impacted by COVID in Australia, at least. And that's largely because there are other mining operations around the world have been closed down in South America and Africa in particular. So the demand for Australian commodities has been strong, and so production levels in mining in Australia has been strong. So mining services businesses likewise are their activities directly relate to production activities, and so the Melco business and the mining sector generally has not been sort of too badly impacted by COVID, apart from the interaction, if you like, of physical interaction of people, and with not being able to meet with clients face to face, or not being able to meet with staff, has been sort of probably the biggest impact. But economically, it hasn't been a significant impact. Although I think those sort of dark clouds are probably on the horizon for the mining sector, and that will have an impact over the next 12 months.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. And so, in effect, your business or the Melco business has actually seen opportunity that's really come out of the COVID environment. Particularly with global competitors having to go into shutdown mode.
Yeah.
Are there any other opportunities that you've seen kind of come out of challenges in terms of, maybe you mentioned yourself that you haven't been able to physically be present in Mackay. What sort of opportunities do you see that have come out of this or may come out of this that may have a longer term impact on how we do business?
I think that's, this is in terms of sort of physical meetings and communication. I guess that's probably one for me it's actually been potentially a positive thing, even though it's inconvenient at the time, but it has placed much more emphasis on the importance of communications. And I think when life was normal, we probably took that for granted. I think now we realise when you can't communicate face to face, and you see the consequences of that not happening, it makes you much more conscious of the importance of good communication. And so whether that's through a Zoom meeting or a telephone call, you're actually much more focused on making sure that communication happens on a regular basis and in a quality manner. And I think, I think that will impact upon a lot of businesses. Most businesses moving forward. I think there'll be more emphasis and more understanding of the importance of good communication and regular communication, which I think we've all taken for granted for too long. And so I think that part of business will actually improve, and that in the time and money that we waste getting to and from meetings and travelling and or walking, driving to the Gold Coast or whatever it happens to be, we can have successful meetings on Zoom back to back. And that, without sort of incurring a lot of unproductive time. So I just think effectiveness of communication and productivity at a senior management level, and that's we all have limited time. So the more time that we can have available to for strategic planning and so on is I think will be important and will be a benefit moving forward.
Yeah, no, look, thanks for that, Mark. Yeah, really resonates in terms of those observations. And again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to share those thoughts with us. I really appreciate it. Of course, yeah, looking forward to catching up before too long in a face-to-face sense
For a
as well.
face-to-face whiskey jack. Yeah, no, I'll look
Absolutely.
forward, look
Always.
forward to that, Steve. No, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks again.
Thanks. See you.